Gamers, I watched one of the videos before from the same channel, and today we're gonna check what makes RTS games fun, meaningful base building. So the last time I watched a video, it was, from these guys, was anti-snowball design. And today we're gonna check the meaningful base building.
To the generals, gentlemen.
Base building is a core pillar of RTS games, but I don't think it's always necessary. Dawn of War 2 did away with base building, and it's one of my favourite RTS games. Personally, I only really find base building engaging if the timing, quantity, and positioning is meaningful and has consequences, rather than just as a way of spending resources and advancing through a tech tree. I'll admit, my position on base building is esoteric in that most RTS fans do enjoy base building regardless. I think that enjoyment of base building comes from a feeling of sandbox creativity and a visual representation of the economic, tech, and production progression that occurs throughout a match.
I mean, I agree with this. Like, if you're building a base just for sake of like throwing random buildings around, it kind of sucks. But when a RTS game does it well, then the base building, it becomes like your own little castle, little base that you're expanding. And the most satisfying part about base building is in maps that are randomly generated, like AoE 2, because you have to decide in the moment where you're going to build your base, where you're going to position your buildings. So I do agree that base building is pretty important and can be a lot of fun, but very few games I feel like do it correctly, because base building needs to be very meaningful for the actual gameplay in order to get that effect, if that makes sense.
While I don't always think it's necessary, I'll generally enjoy base building as there's something innately satisfying about it. But I think there's so much potential for base building in RTS games to be better, and some RTS have already nailed it. Today I'll be exploring examples of how some RTS have made base building meaningful and strategic. Economy and production. Age of Empires 2 has 4 resource types, which are gathered in different ways. Players have to plan their base for villages to be as productive as possible, but also defended from harassment. Players have to think about the paths their villagers will take on their way to and from the drop-off sites, and update drop-off points as trees are cleared and animals hunted. Rise of Nations has similar resource types to Age of Empires 2, but its lack of resource...
I just want to say, I really want to do a playthrough of Rise of Nations. I used to play that game, and I really want to do a playthrough of it.
Depletion and villager drops removes the complexity of placement. Rather than trying to force meaningful base building, first consider how a game's economy will naturally have an impact on the importance of base building. A similar perspective can be applied to production. If income is slow and build times are fast, like in Command & Conquer, then there's no reason to build multiple production structures of the same kind. Whereas in StarCraft, needing to invest in multiple barracks to effectively spend all of your minerals adds a huge layer to preparing for strategies and transitioning between them. Blocking. Base building placement can be meaningful as a means to block access. This could be walling off or creating choke points and limiting surface area to reduce the efficiency of melee units. It sounds simple, but there's a lot that needs to go into an RTS for those mechanics to actually matter. Not only does StarCraft and Warcraft...
That's the thing, because technically in every game, if you make a wall, it's going to help. But it depends how the game is actually played, if that wall is going to be properly used. Because if you make an RTS, like obvious one, right? And all the units are ranged, the wall is not really going to help you much, because, you know. But it depends a lot on the gameplay. And if you can actually harass the opponent's base with units, so there's a need for a wall up. There's a lot of RTS games where you never wall, because if the opponent is in your base, it's kind of like it's over already, or you have too much vision where that can't even happen.
Warcraft 3 have lots of melee units, but ranged units have very short attack ranges relative to their model size. A blob of stalkers getting clumped up are much less efficient than if they were firing from a nice concave. On the other hand, the infantry units in Command & Conquer are tiny for their massive attack ranges, so being limited by choke points doesn't affect their DPS, and structures won't be a deterrent. Utility. The more utility buildings have, the more their placement will matter. Warcraft 3 is a fantastic example of this, with quirks such as shop structures that sell items to heroes,
Warcraft 3
ancients
does
that
this
attack
well
nearby units, orc burrows that are garrisoned by peons, moon wells that replenish, farms to shield turrets, and many other examples. The art of base building in Warcraft 3 is a crucial skill, and the hyper-vulnerability of structures during construction, combined with open maps and no natural high ground, means that even the timing of base building is important. Command & Conquer Generals also has good examples, with the GLA Palace being both a tech structure and a garrisonable emplacement. That creates a trade-off of wanting to place it somewhere safe or boosting a defensive line. Additional vulnerabilities. The more ways players interact with buildings, the more meaningful their placement will be. Command & Conquer is the only franchise I can think of that gives buildings more vulnerability types than just simply attacking them. From capturing them with engineers, to stealing money with spies, or blowing them up with a stealth commando. When placing a super weapon, you can't just think about is it safe from attack, you also have to think about is it fully covered by detection from all angles, so a scumbag saboteur doesn't come along and reset the countdown timer.
I'm personally not a big fan of those kinds of mechanics where like someone just comes in with engineer and takes your building or whatever. Like I personally don't like that. I really love the interaction of harassment and walling off for the purpose of defending harassments. Not a big fan of these kinds of things where you like have to make turrets all around your base just because an infantry unit is going to come in and like do something. I don't know. I feel like it's kind of weird, and just when an opponent gets into your base with 2 units, they shouldn't kill you. You know, they should harass your mineral income or whatever. But that's why walls, I think, are great versus melee units, and why the best walling, now that I think about it, in RTS games is in StarCraft 2, StarCraft 1, Warcraft 3, and Age of Empires, because they have melee units and they have those kinds of harassment gameplay based, where having a wall will help you, if not in the early game, mid or late game. You know, eventually it will come in handy, and there's no reason not to. Meanwhile here, there's no reason to make walls because of what he just said.
This can also be used to instantly fully repair a building, so placing a barracks directly behind a command center or other crucial building could heavily pay off. If an RTS is made with extra bonuses and vulnerability to structures, then base building will naturally become more meaningful. What if infestors in StarCraft 2 could capture a barracks to spawn infested Terrans? How would that affect base building?
That was an ability in Wings of Liberty beta. I don't know if you guys remember. That was an actual infestor ability. It infests a building and spawns a shit ton of infested Terrans.
Busy workers. The placement of base building in Company of Heroes is not meaningful. There's a couple of small quirks, but mostly it doesn't matter where you plonk down your structures. Company of Heroes makes base building meaningful in a different way. Rather than about specific positioning, base building is a time investment from something that actually matters. Base building in most RTS comes from worker units that are either idle sitting in base waiting, or are collecting a resource and are ready to be pulled with little consequence. But not in Company of Heroes. Engineers aren't cheap and have enormous utility between capturing points, repairing, building fortifications, planting and sweeping mines, and being in combat, especially with a flamethrower. Every time you build a structure in Company of Heroes, it's being done with the opportunity cost of all of those engineer functions, and that adds a layer of strategy to do with retreat timings and map presence. The more utility you can pack into worker units,
I'm not a big fan of that, to be honest. Like, I played Company of Heroes and I played Iron Harvest. That kind of base building is irrelevant. Like, it's to a point where why is there even a base building at all? Like, they only have 2 buildings, right? Or 3 buildings, however many. And it's like, you make them every game. There's no option which building you go first, right? There's a clear pattern where you go. And it doesn't feel satisfying. It kind of feels pointless. It feels like something you have to do, you know? And everyone's doing it. Not a big fan of that, to be honest. This game looks cool, though. 8-bit armies? I haven't seen this.
the more meaningful their participation on the map will be, and therefore, the more strategic consideration goes into base building.
That's a cool game.
Command
I
and
like
Conquer
it.
Generals does utility on support units very well, such as the construction dozers that are used for crushing infantry, which especially comes into play in the early game because of how they crush workers to deny GLA tunnels. Vulnerable workers. In general, I find slow, expensive, and fragile worker units to be more interesting than fast and expendable ones, because then sniping workers becomes a specific type of harassment. There's no quirky utility for the engineers in Supreme Commander, but they're still significant as a form of harassment because of how they're balanced and their movement speed relative to the map sizes. Building mechanics. As much as I love...
I don't know. What do I like? Having slower workers or more workers? I never thought about this. Like, would I rather have workers like in Command and Conquer? Like Red Alert? Or would I have it like StarCraft 2? I feel like I like it more like StarCraft 2, StarCraft 1 and Age of Empires, to be honest, than like Warcraft 3 or Command and Conquer. Because there's something to it where like, it's about the visual, it's about the base building part, right? If I build a base and then there's just one mine or two miners going, it's like your base seems very small. But when you have 60, 70, 80, or in Age of Empires like up to 100 workers, it feels more satisfying because you can see everything kind of working together. And yeah, and that's a good point. One big worker in competitive play is a huge like weakness for the game. Because if I'm playing Red Alert, right? Let's say this just came out, right? And you have 3 workers, 3 miners, and you lose one. That's game over, you know? Like that's it. 3 workers compared to 2 is gigantic. You know, that's 33% of your economy just gone completely. So that's actually a good point. I prefer to have more workers, to be honest. I really like Age of Empire, the way they do workers. I think it's really cool.
Command and Conquer, I think worker units are a better mechanic than buildings magically deploying from the sky. Though Command and Conquer 3 and Red Alert 3 do have some units which are analogous to worker units. Build radius is limited in those games, so if you want to expand out to distant resources, you'll need to send out and deploy an emissary or Sputnik. These build radius units are expensive, slow, and fragile, which opens up an opportunity to snipe them en route. Once deployed, they're much tougher, but can still be destroyed to prevent building placement in that region. It's a cool mechanic, but sadly they're rarely used, as they're undercut by the free ability to simply unpack the MCV and deploy it somewhere else with its massive build radius. Balancing those games aside, traditional worker units may not be suitable for an RTS, but there's still room to add depth and harassment options to base building. This can also be seen with the Empire in Red Alert 3 that use weak mobile cores that deploy into a structure. Scouting. Base structures are generally the first step of a strategic investment, so they provide the best form of scouting. Scout a Dark Shrine and you know you need detection for those incoming Dark Templar, you're dead. But scout mass gateways and you know you'll need bunkers for that all-in. When the scouting of base building matters, then scouting and counter-scouting becomes a big part of the game and helps it flow by creating...
And that's why games like Company of Heroes and Iron Harvest don't have any scouting. Because there's no need to, right? Everyone's going the same thing. There's not enough production. There's no tech. So I don't like that. I like... I think maybe StarCraft 2 is too extreme in that sense. Like, oh, it's DT, and then the opponent's like, oh, I guess I'm dead because I went DTs, which is risky tech. I got scouted, and now I'm at a disadvantage. But the best game that does scouting, in my opinion, is Age of Empires 2. Because the stuff you scout is not game ending, right? If I scout a barracks, faster barracks opening, it's not like, oh, that's it, the game's over. It's like, okay, you can react to it, the opponent can then transition if they want to, and stuff like that. So that's part of base building and walling off that adds on to the scouting, like you said, which is actually a very good point. Because it adds another layer to the game, and it's not just about massing units, there's more to it.
Small skirmishes. Scouting also needs to be designed in a way where it's fair and not too easy or too difficult. and the significance of structures at a particular timing needs to mean something that the enemy can read. Scouting a Dark Shrine wouldn't be useful if it also unlocked Colossus and High Templar. As for build times, the longer the unit build times are relative to resource income, the more production structures are needed. The more production structures are needed, the easier it is to scout specific strategies. Adjacency bonus. Like with many of these RTS discussions, applying them to large-scale RTS games can be quite challenging. Supreme Commander takes an unconventional approach to make base building meaningful through its use of adjacency bonus. Building economy structures next to certain buildings will provide a bonus such as reduced energy consumption. I personally don't think this is a good approach and I wouldn't recommend it.
I don't like that because then it forces you to do something. Whenever a game forces you to do something, I think it's bad for the game. It doesn't matter if it's making certain tech or opening certain route, but I think players should have options. And if you make it so that a thing powers up the buildings around and it gives it a bonus, you're never going to ever build any buildings that are not around that thing. You're always going to just shove everything into it. So,
because it's not creative, it's a mathematical efficiency telling you the exact way you should be placing structures. There's no player agency. In theory, it's offset by the volatility of power plants, but that hardly matters in a real match. Adjacency bonus to that style would be a better mechanic if there were meaningful trade-offs between different types of bonuses that you have to weigh up. Mutually exclusive adjacency bonus is how you can think about the tech labs and reactors for Terran buildings in StarCraft 2. Those add-ons are especially a great mechanic that adds so much strategy because of how Terran buildings can lift off to swap between the different add-ons. In summary, most RTS players tend to enjoy base building just for the sake of it, but it can be way more fun and provide an avenue for huge depth if the specific positioning of structures has consequences. The game's economy will heavily tie into the importance of structure placement, but base building can also be meaningful through many other ways. Structures can be used to block pathing or funnel troops, so long as the game is designed where clumping limits DPS. If buildings have additional utility and vulnerabilities, then interaction types are created, which naturally gives their positioning benefits and consequences. The timing of base building can be more strategic if builder units have additional utility, as that creates an opportunity cost to having them idle in the base. Otherwise, builder units should be a combination of slow, expensive, or vulnerable to provide harassment targets. Lastly, an RTS should be designed in a way so that base building reveals strategic information to create the dynamic of scouting and counter-scouting, which encourages players to hide important tech structures and create small skirmishes. Thank you for watching. I'm Callum McCall of The General's Gentleman. Subscribe to the channel to watch all of our RTS shoutcasts, video essays, and podcasts all about RTS game design.
I mean, I 100%, I agree with this video. It's funny because I think they bring up a lot of good points, and I actually really enjoy watching videos like these because it makes you think about things that you don't really consider, right? Like, you don't really consider that actually having, I mean, not consider, but I never thought about this, that having certain tech in the game that is for certain unit forces scouting and counter-scouting and makes it extremely important in a game. And then I realized as I was watching the video that certain games have no scouting at all because there's just no need. What are you scouting for? And in order to create something like that, you need to create, like he mentioned, meaningful base building and important structures. I 100% agree that, I mean, at the same time, you shouldn't force players to wall off every game. Like, it shouldn't be a mandatory thing, but there should be weaknesses if you don't and weaknesses if you do. So, for example, in TVT, in Terran vs. Terran in StarCraft 2, if you wall off, you prevent scouting, you prevent Hellion run-bys, and that's great. That's a good thing, right? The weakness is, well, you have to go to the ramp, you lose some income, but also later in the game, because all the opponent's units are ranged, they can easily be killed. So there's a weakness if you don't do it, but there's a weakness if you do it. And that's what gives the player an option, a choice that they can do and decide what they want to do with that. It's the same thing with other matchups, and it's the same thing with games like Age of Empires or Warcraft 3. You don't necessarily need to do it, and sometimes it will bite you in the ass when you position certain buildings a certain way, but if you do that, it opens up possibility to play differently, which is something that I've bashed on so many times, that the most important thing in RTS games and games in general is to give players choice and not force them to do something. So there it is. I really like this video. I enjoyed it quite a bit. I'm going to link the video in the chat. I'm definitely going to watch more videos for General's Gentlemen. They have, I think, 6-7 more videos like this where they discuss stuff about RTS games, and that I'm definitely going to check out. But for now, if you're watching on YouTube, thanks so much for watching. Let me know what you think below. Little wave, and I'll see you guys tomorrow with another video, another stream. Good night.